Poor janitor shelters 20 freezing bikers. Next morning, 2,000 Hell's Angels stop outside her door. Cold winds tore through the night, carrying with them a cruel whistle that rattled every loose board of the small cottage standing at the edge of the Denver plains. The snow had started before dusk, and by now it blanketed the world in white silence. Inside, a dim light flickered from a rusted oil lamp, its glow trembling against cracked plaster walls. Maria Rosales sat hunched over a wooden table, needle in hand, mending a tear in her faded winter coat. Her fingers were swollen from years of hard labor and winter chill. The skin was rough, the knuckles darkened, but her stitching was neat, the kind of precision that came from decades of surviving, not thriving. Every motion was careful. Every breath was weary. 6 days a week, Maria cleaned the marble floors and gilded mirrors of the Van Allen estate, a home large enough to swallow her whole cottage 100 times over. She polished silver she'd never owned and washed linen finer than anything she'd ever worn. They paid her barely enough to eat, but Maria never complained. Work, after all, was sacred. "Work keeps me alive," she would whisper to herself each morning as she tied her scarf and stepped into the bitter cold. But on this night, her only day of rest, even the walls seemed to sigh with fatigue. The wind howled. The lamps stuttered. Outside, the storm thickened until the world disappeared. She rose and pressed her palm to the window pane. The glass bit cold against her skin. "Dios mío," she murmured. "Please let the roof hold." Behind her, the small photograph of her late husband, Raphael, sat propped on a shelf. His smile, worn by time, still warmed her. He'd died 5 winters ago at a construction site accident, building homes for families who would never know his name. He used to say, "We came here to work, Maria, to give something better than what we had." She still believed that, even if all she had left now was the ache of that belief. Then, through the wail of the wind, came a sound she didn't recognize. A deep, rolling growl that rose and fell like thunder, crawling closer. At first, she thought it was the storm itself, the mountain wind crashing through the valley. But then came the rhythm. The pulse. The unmistakable roar of engines. 1, then 3, then 20. Maria froze. Headlights flared through the curtain of snow, 20 glowing eyes moving slowly up the hill toward her home. Shadows loomed, heavy and slow. The air trembled. Engines cut off one by one, until only the wind remained. Then a knock. Hard, slow, solid. Her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment she didn't move. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Everyone in town had heard stories about the Hell's Angels, men with tattoos like scars and jackets that spoke louder than their words. They were the kind of men people crossed streets to avoid, the kind whose reputation came with fear. And now, 20 of them were standing in her yard. Another knock, louder this time. Maria's eyes darted toward the photo of Raphael. She could almost hear his voice, calm, certain kind. "Even the hardest men get cold, Maria. If you can help, you must." Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Outside, a deep voice cut through the wind. "Ma'am, please. We're freezing out here." Maria hesitated. She looked around her tiny home, the chipped table, the single blanket, the pot of leftover broth cooling on the stove. She had so little, barely enough for herself. But her heart wouldn't let her turn away. With a trembling breath, she unlatched the door. The wind rushed in, carrying snowflakes that glittered in the lamplight. Standing before her were 20 men, faces red from the cold, leather jackets slick with ice, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At their front stood a massive man with a graying beard and eyes that held both steel and sorrow. His jacket bore a patch that read Hulk. Beside him, taller but thinner, was Big Tony, his gaze sharp but not cruel. Behind them stood others, Patch, Diesel, Goose, Snake, and more whose names she'd soon learn, but whose eyes already spoke of exhaustion and hunger. Maria's voice shook. "You shouldn't be out in this storm. Come in. I have little, but it's warm." They looked at one another, uncertain. She could see it, the hesitation, the pride, the disbelief that anyone would open a door for men like them. Hulk finally nodded once. "You're saving our hides tonight, ma'am." And just like that, 20 giants stepped carefully into her tiny wooden home. Inside, the warmth of the stove hit their faces, melting the frost in their beards. They removed their gloves, their boots thudding heavy against the floorboards. The house smelled of cinnamon, dust, and soap, strange comfort after days of gasoline and rain. Maria moved quietly, her small frame darting between them like a sparrow among eagles. She poured hot water into cups, tore what remained of her bread, and ladled broth into chipped bowls. "It's not much," she murmured, "but it will help." The men accepted her offering without a word at first. But as the fire cracked and steam rose from their cups, the tension began to thaw. Big Tony took a sip and let out a low hum. "Best meal I've had in a week." A ripple of laughter broke through the room. Small, unsure, but real. Maria smiled faintly. For the first time in years, the silence of her home was filled with voices, rough, low, human. One by one, the bikers began to talk. Not about engines or danger, but about life. About brothers lost on the road. About mothers who prayed for them. About the long miles between mistakes and forgiveness. The storm outside howled harder, but inside, something warmer was taking root. Something Maria hadn't felt in a long, long time. And though she didn't know it yet, by opening that door, she hadn't just saved 20 freezing bikers. She had summoned an army of angels on wheels. The door creaked wider, and the 20 men stood motionless for a moment, half in shadow, half in the trembling amber light spilling from Maria's lamp. Their leather jackets glistened with melting ice. Steam rose from their shoulders like breath from beasts. Maria's heart pounded so loud she feared they could hear it. Her house was no more than a single room, with a small stove and a cot pushed against one wall. The air smelled of kerosene and wet wool. 20 men, heavy with silence, seemed to fill it to its edges. "Come in," she repeated softly, motioning with a hand that trembled just enough to betray her nerves. "You'll freeze out there." The biggest one, Hulk, looked around, eyes scanning every corner as if assessing the space for danger. Beside him stood Big Tony, broader through the chest, his limp barely hidden beneath the drape of his coat. Behind them, Patch lowered his head, studying Maria's face in the flickering light. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he said nothing. The men hesitated, their boots crunching snow at the doorway. Maria could almost see the conflict written across their faces. They had spent their lives on the road, in motels, under bridges, accustomed to suspicion, never to kindness. Finally, Hulk gave a single nod. "All right, boys." Inside, they moved carefully, trying not to break anything, their presence bending the room around them. The old floorboards creaked beneath their weight. Maria hurried toward the stove, where a small pot of broth still simmered. She ladled what little she had into chipped bowls, filling the air with a thin aroma of garlic and onion. "It's not much," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "But it's warm." Big Tony removed his gloves, flexing fingers stiff from the cold. "You're a saint, ma'am," he muttered. "We were about 2 miles from freezing solid." Hulk let out a low grunt of agreement, though his eyes never softened. He was still watching her, like a wolf studying the hand that dared feed it. Maria met his stare, unflinching. "Soup first," she said simply. "Then you can glare at me all you want." For the first time, something close to amusement tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough." One by one, the men accepted the bowls. Steam rose in ghostly ribbons as they cupped their hands around the warmth. They ate in silence at first, too cold and too wary to speak. The only sound was the scrape of spoons against ceramic and the crackle of firewood. Maria moved quietly among them, laying dry towels across the back of chairs, pouring hot water into mugs, her movements efficient, practiced. For a moment she looked less like a frightened woman and more like a nurse in her own ward, tending, watching, healing without words. That was when she noticed the cough. Deep, raw, and painful. It came from a tall, dark-haired man sitting near the stove Diesel. He tried to hide it behind a rough laugh, but the sound tore at his chest. Maria frowned. "You shouldn't be outside in weather like this," she said, setting down her ladle. "You'll make yourself sick." Diesel looked embarrassed. "Road doesn't stop for weather, ma'am." "Well," Maria said, fetching a clean rag, "the Lord made the storm so that men like you remember to rest." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, soft, uncertain, but real. Even Hulk cracked a grin. The air shifted. The stiffness in the room melted into something warmer. Big Tony leaned back against the wall, stretching out his leg with a low groan. "Been a long time since anyone fed us without asking what we'd done wrong first." Maria smiled faintly. Hungry men don't need judgment. They need food. Patch lifted his gaze again, his expression thoughtful. There it was again, the faint echo of memory. her voice, her kindness. He had heard both before, but he stayed silent, watching her move between them like light flickering through storm clouds. Minutes stretched into hours. The snow outside pressed hard against the windows, but inside, the warmth grew thick and gentle. The bikers, once tense and guarded, began to thaw. They talked softly about broken engines, lost friends, the road that both freed and cursed them. Maria listened as she poured another round of broth. Her shoulders relaxed. Her fear had burned away, replaced by something else entirely. As she set down the final bowl, she glanced around at the men who filled her home. They looked different now, less like strangers, more like souls adrift in the same storm that had long carried her. She folded her hands and whispered more to herself than to them. The Lord says kindness doesn't ask who you are. The words floated in the stillness, soft but steady. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by 20 shadows that had once frightened her, Maria Rosales felt something she hadn't known in years, the warmth of being exactly where she was meant to be. The storm outside grew heavier, hammering against the windows as if trying to break its way in. But inside Maria's small cottage, the air was soft and golden. The fire in the stove crackled, fighting back the chill that seeped through the walls. Shadows moved over the men's faces, 20 bikers who just hours ago had been strangers standing in the snow. Now, they sat crowded together in the flickering glow, cups of broth in their hands, steam rising from their wet jackets. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the sound of the storm and the soft pop of firewood filled the silence. Then Big Tony cleared his throat. "Guess it's been a while since we sat still like this," he said, staring into the flames. "Usually when we stop, it's cause something went wrong." The others chuckled, but there was weariness in the sound. Maria was sitting on her old wooden chair, hands wrapped around her cup. Her dark eyes moved from one man to another. Beneath the leather, the scars, and the patches of their jackets, she saw something familiar, the same exhaustion she carried home every night after work. Hulk, the leader, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The firelight cut across the lines of his face, showing age and pain. "My brother used to say the road fixes everything," he began. His voice was gravelly, like a man not used to speaking gently. He was a Marine, fought in Afghanistan. Said if he made it home, he'd buy a bike, ride across America, and never look back. Hulk paused. The room fell still. "He never made it home," he said quietly. "Car bomb took his whole unit. I found out while I was on the road. Been riding ever since. Not because I'm running, because I can't stop. If I stop, I think about him." The fire cracked loudly. No one spoke for several seconds. Maria bowed her head slightly, whispering a small prayer in Spanish under her breath. Then Big Tony gave a small nod toward Hulk, his voice rough with sympathy. "I got a kid. Little girl. Well, not so little now. 10 years since I saw her. Her mom moved her out of state after I got locked up for something stupid. I keep telling myself one day I'll ride that way and see her again." But he trailed off, looking into his cup. "The road just keeps going, don't it?" Maria felt her throat tighten. These men the world called dangerous, were just carrying ghosts. The same kind of ghosts that haunted her. She took a slow breath. "My husband's name was Raphael," she said softly. "He worked construction. Every day, he said we'd save enough to buy a little house that was ours. Just ours." Her eyes drifted to the photo frame on the shelf. Then one day, the building fell. The walls didn't hold. He didn't come home. The room was silent except for the wind. "I crossed the border with him," she continued. "We came here to work hard, to be part of this country. But after he died, no one remembered his name. They only remembered to tell me when the rent was late." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "So I cleaned floors. Big ones. The kind you could lose your soul in. And I keep going. Because that's what he would have done." Her words hung in the air, fragile, powerful, real. The men looked at her differently now. Not as a poor woman or a stranger, but as someone who carried the same kind of weight they did. Hulk nodded slowly. "You're tougher than most people I've met on the road." Maria shook her head. "Not tough. Just still here." The fire popped again, sending a small spray of sparks upward. For the first time that night, laughter, real laughter, rippled through the room. Goose started telling a story about getting lost in the Rockies, and Snake followed it with a joke so bad even Hulk cracked a grin. For a moment, the storm outside didn't matter. The cottage, though small and patched with age, felt like the safest place in the world. Then, without warning, a harsh cough shattered the peace. Diesel doubled over, clutching his chest. His bowl fell, spilling broth across the floor. The sound of his gasping breath filled the tiny room. Maria jumped to her feet. "Move him closer to the fire," she shouted. The men reacted instantly. Big Tony lifted Diesel's shoulders while Hulk steadied him. Maria grabbed a cloth and pressed it to his mouth. It came away streaked with red. Her heart lurched. "Dios mío," she whispered, already reaching for her old metal first aid box. "Don't speak, just breathe. Slowly. You hear me?" Diesel nodded weakly, sweat beading on his brow. The men watched helplessly as Maria worked, her hands moving fast, steady, certain. The storm screamed outside, but inside, all that existed was the sound of her voice, calm, determined, unafraid. And in that moment, every man in the room knew this tiny janitor, with a trembling lamp and a borrowed stove, was the bravest soul they'd ever met. The storm had quieted to a steady hum against the window panes, but inside Maria's cottage, chaos churned around the fire. Diesel gasped for breath, his body trembling, his skin slick with sweat. The cough that had haunted him all night now tore through him like thunder. Maria knelt beside him, the light from the stove flickering across her face. Her voice was low, steady, and commanding, the kind of voice that left no room for panic. "Big Tony, bring me that towel," she said. "Hulk, hold him up gently." The men obeyed without question. They moved like soldiers under orders, their leather jackets creaking as they crouched beside her. The air, thick with smoke and fear, trembled with the sound of Diesel's labored breathing. Maria's hands moved quickly, damp cloth to his forehead, fingers to his pulse, a soft Spanish prayer whispered under her breath. "Santo Dios protegelo, Dale Fuerza, Holy God, protect him, give him strength." Hulk watched her, this small woman with calloused hands and eyes that didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of them. Not of their size, their tattoos, or the roughness in their voices. In that moment, she wasn't just a janitor in a forgotten town. She was something else, something sacred. Maria reached for a small tin box beneath her table. Inside were bandages, ointments, and old medicine bottles labeled in Spanish. "I used to help at a clinic back home," she murmured. "We didn't have much, but we learned to use what we had." She mixed crushed tablets into warm water and pressed the cup to Diesel's lips. "Despacio, slowly," she coaxed. He obeyed, his breath shallow but steadying. No one spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and Maria's soft voice, soothing in a rhythm older than fear. Hulk's jaw tightened as he watched her. He'd seen death before, too much of it. On the road, in the army, in the eyes of men who'd lost everything. But this was different. This was life fighting to stay. And it was being led by a woman half his size who hadn't hesitated to open her door to 20 strangers. He looked around the room. His crew, men who faced bar fights, rain, and the long miles of asphalt, now stood in reverent silence. Goose's usual smirk was gone. Snake's hands were folded. Even Big Tony, who could lift a Harley with one arm, looked as if he were praying. Maria dabbed Diesel's face with the towel again, whispering softly, "Tranquilo, hijo. You'll be all right. Come, son. You'll be all right." The word son hit something deep inside the room. It softened the edges. The men shifted, quietly, humbly, as though that single word had drawn them closer together. Patch, sitting near the door, felt his chest tighten. He had heard that same word before years ago. That same voice. That same accent. It was her. He remembered it now. The desert heat, the sting of blood on his face, and the sound of her voice telling him to hold on. He'd been half dead near the border, beaten by smugglers, left to die in the dirt. She had found him, given him soup, whispered the same Spanish prayers. He hadn't known her name then, but her voice, he would never forget it. And here she was again, kneeling before another broken man, saving him without hesitation. Hulk cleared his throat, breaking the spell for a moment. "He gonna make it?" Maria didn't look up. "He's strong," she said softly, "but he needs rest, warmth, and silence." Hulk nodded once. "You heard the lady. Nobody talks unless it's quiet." The men chuckled quietly at the contradiction, but their eyes were filled with, The leader of the Hells Angels, a man feared across half the country, had just taken orders from a janitor in a floral apron. An hour passed. Diesel's breathing eased. His color returned. The tension that had gripped the room began to loosen, replaced by something gentler. Gratitude, respect, maybe even love. Maria sat back finally, wiping her hands on her apron. The fatigue in her shoulders showed, but her smile was faint and peaceful. "You'll be fine now," she said. "The worst is past." Hulk looked down at Diesel, then back at her. His throat worked as he searched for words. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. Maria met his gaze. "I couldn't do nothing." He nodded slowly. His rough hands tightened around his knees. "You know, ma'am, I've seen a lot on the road. Cruelty, selfishness, men tearing each other apart. I stopped believing there were good people left." He paused, his voice low, breaking at the edges. "But tonight, you've given us more than food, ma'am. You've given us peace." Maria's eyes softened, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a full smile, small, tired, and holy. Outside, the storm began to fade into silence. Inside, the men sat quietly, heads bowed, as if afraid to disturb the peace that had taken root in that humble room. For the first time in a long, long while, they all felt it, a kind of stillness that only grace can leave behind. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the valley. The wind no longer screamed against the windows. It sighed, tired and spent. Inside Maria's cottage, 20 men lay scattered on the floor in makeshift beds, jackets rolled as pillows, blankets shared without a word. The fire had burned low, glowing faintly like the last heartbeat of the night. Maria sat in her chair, her eyelids heavy, her hands folded in her lap. The rhythm of steady breathing filled the room, the deep, exhausted breaths of men who hadn't slept this peacefully in years. She was about to drift off herself when she heard something, a voice soft and low, slipping through the walls. Spanish. Prayer. Maria rose quietly, her bare feet whispering against the wooden floor. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and opened the door. The cold bit at her face, but the sky had cleared, the moon now hanging bright above the snow-covered hills. Near the porch, kneeling in the snow, was Patch. His jacket was draped over his shoulders, his breath forming clouds as he murmured words she hadn't heard in years. Dios mío, perdoname por mis pecados. Gracias por dejarme verla otra vez. My God, forgive me for my sins. Thank you for letting me see her again. Maria's breath caught. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. ¿Qué dijiste, hijo? What did you say, son? Patch turned. For a heartbeat, he looked like that young man from her memory, the one lying broken and bleeding in the desert dust. His face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. You remember me," he whispered. Maria blinked, confused at first. Then the pieces began to fall into place. His voice, his eyes, the faint scar running along his jawline. "El muchacho," she breathed. "The boy from the border." Patch stood slowly, emotion thick in his throat. "I thought you were a dream," he said. "That night. I didn't think I'd live till morning." Snow crunched softly beneath her feet as she stepped closer. "You were half dead. I almost couldn't carry you. They were searching the road. I hid you behind the fence near the river." He nodded, his voice breaking. "You fed me soup. Lent me your husband's jacket. I still got it, packed away in my saddlebag." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. She hadn't thought about that night in years. Back then, she was newly arrived, still clinging to hope. She found him on the side of the road, beaten by smugglers, abandoned to die before he could cross. She'd risked her own safety to hide him from border patrol, to feed him, to help him heal. And when he was strong enough to walk, she told him one thing: keep going. The world may forget you, but God won't. Now that boy stood before her again, a grown man, leather-clad and road-worn, his voice thick with gratitude. "I never forgot, Senora," Patch said, his eyes glistening. "Not your face, not your voice, not the soup." Maria smiled through her tears. "And I never thought I'd see you again, hijo." Behind them, the cottage door opened. Hulk stood there, broad shoulders filling the doorway, his brow furrowed. "Everything all right out here?" Patch turned toward him, his voice steady but trembling with emotion. "You remember that story I told, about the woman who saved me at the border? The one I said I owed my life to?" Hulk nodded. "It's her," Patch said. "Maria Rosales. She's the one." The doorway filled as the others stirred, Big Tony, Diesel, Goose, Snake. One by one, they came out into the moonlight, their boots crunching in the snow. She saved me when nobody else would, Patch continued, his voice thick. Gave me food, shelter, mercy. And now, years later, she does the same thing again, this time for all of us. Silence fell. The kind of silence that carries weight. Big Tony looked at Maria, his throat tight. You did that for him? For a stranger. Maria nodded slowly. He wasn't a stranger. He was a soul who needed help. Same as you. Hulk's jaw clenched, his gaze flicking between Patch and Maria. He was a man used to rough justice, debts paid in iron and blood. But this was something deeper. He exhaled hard, a cloud of steam leaving his lips. I've been on the road a long time, he said quietly. Met good folks. Met devils. But I never met anyone like you, ma'am. Patch wiped his eyes, embarrassed. She's the reason I made it here. The reason I found the road, the club, hell, the reason I'm still breathing. The other men bowed their heads slightly, each one understanding the weight of what that meant. Even Diesel, weak but awake, murmured, Damn, guess angels really do ride bikes. The snow glittered around them, moonlight washing the scene in silver. Maria stood small and still, surrounded by men who suddenly seemed far less dangerous and far more human. Hulk looked at Big Tony, his voice low. We'll make it, right? Tony nodded, eyes wet. Hulk's gaze returned to Maria. The road pays its debts, ma'am. Always. Maria didn't understand what that meant, not yet. But when Hulk spoke those words, something shifted in the night air. The wind carried them away, as if even the mountains were listening. The storm was over, but something far greater had just begun. The night surrendered slowly. The last of the storm had passed hours ago, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt sacred. Snow blanketed the ground in shimmering white, smooth and untouched, except for the line of boot prints leading to Maria's small cottage. The air was still heavy with the scent of burned wood and damp leather. Inside, the fire had burned down to amber coals. One by one, the bikers stirred, yawning, stretching, rubbing the stiffness from their necks. Their jackets steamed faintly as the warmth of dawn seeped into the room. For the first time, Maria could see their faces clearly in the morning light. Without the shadows, without the storm, they didn't look like the fearsome figures whispered about in town. They looked tired. Human. The lines around their eyes told stories of miles written and memories carried too long. Diesel, weak but alive, sat near the stove with a blanket draped over his shoulders. Patch hovered protectively beside him, his hand resting lightly on his brother's back. Big Tony limped to the door, whistling low as he peeked outside. Well, would you look at that? Blue sky. Thought we'd never see one again. Maria smiled faintly as she knelt near the fire. Her joints ached, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The storm had come and gone, and somehow her home still stood, not just her walls and roof, but the quiet place in her soul that had long been forgotten. She turned to the table, where she had been working since before sunrise. There, in a neat row, lay 20 small crosses made of twine. She'd woven them from the frayed threads of an old mop handle and bits of straw, fingers steady with purpose. It was her way, simple, humble, of sending them off with something to remember her by. When the men were ready, she stood before them, hands clasped around the bundle of crosses. I don't have money, she began softly, or fine things, but I made these. For you. The room fell silent. She stepped toward each man, pressing a cross into his rough, scarred hand. For the road, she said each time. For protection. And to remind you that kindness always finds its way back. The men didn't speak. They couldn't. Most of them hadn't been given something without condition in years, maybe ever. When she reached Hulk, she hesitated. He stood tall, his jacket slung over one shoulder, eyes hidden beneath his brow. She pressed the small twine cross into his palm, her hand trembling slightly against the strength of his. Even the hardest men, she said softly, need someone to pray for them. For a long moment, Hulk said nothing. Then he nodded once, his voice rough. We don't deserve it, ma'am. But, thank you. Maria's eyes shimmered. Nobody earns grace, she said. That's why it's grace. Big Tony cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We'll be back to see you, Maria. That's a promise. She smiled sadly. Promises fade with the miles, Tony. I know how roads can steal men away. "Not this time," he said. "Not with you." Outside, the world glowed gold with the first light of dawn. Steam rose from the bikes, their chrome gleaming beneath a thin coat of frost. One by one, the engines roared to life, filling the valley with low thunder. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, eyes wide with disbelief. 20 Hell's Angels rolling out from the cottage of poor Janitor, waving as they went. Maria stood on her porch, her shawl drawn tight, watching as the men mounted their bikes. Her heart swelled with pride and sorrow all at once. She felt like a mother watching her sons ride away into the wideless world. Hulk was the last to move. He started his engine, then hesitated. His gloved hands gripped the handlebars, but he didn't look back right away. Instead, he reached up, tugged off one of his black leather gloves, and set on the porch railing. He didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Maria stared at the glove, the worn leather, the red stitching, the faint mark of oil along its edge. It was large enough to swallow both her hands whole. When she looked up again, he was already gone, the roar of engines fading into the distance until the only sound left was the whisper of wind over snow. The silence that followed was almost too big for her small house. Maria picked up the glove, pressed it to her chest, and felt the warmth that still clung to it. A quiet laugh, half a sob, half a prayer, escaped her lips. "Adios, mis hijos del camino," she murmured. "Goodbye, my sons of the road." She turned back toward her cottage, the twine scraps still on her table, the faint smell of soup lingering in the air. The house felt larger now, not because it was empty, but because love had filled it, even if only for a single night. She hung Hulk's glove on a nail beside her husband's photograph, just under the old rosary. It looked right there, a symbol of strength beside the man who had once taught her courage. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow in gold. Maria stood by the window, smiling faintly through her tears. The storm had passed. The road had taken her visitors away. And though she didn't know it yet, the silence she felt that morning wasn't an ending. It was the pause before the thunder returned. The morning after the storm had been so still that Maria almost forgot what noise felt like. The valley lay under a soft quilt of snow, shimmering beneath a pale winter sun. Icicles clung to her porch, catching the light like glass tears. She had spent the early hours cleaning, not because the house needed it, but because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. The 20 men who had filled her home with laughter and life were gone, their boot prints fading into the white. Now only the echo of their voices lingered. Their mugs still sat by the stove. A faint scent of smoke and leather still hung in the air. Maria swept the porch slowly, the old broom gliding through snow that glittered like crushed crystal. For a moment, she paused and looked toward the road. The world was peaceful. "Maybe it was all a dream," she whispered. Her gaze drifted to the black leather glove hanging beside her husband's photo. It swung gently with the wind, tapping the wall like a heartbeat. A reminder that it had been real. That they had been real. She smiled faintly, her breath misting in the cold. "Wherever you are, Hios, may God guide your road." Then she felt it. A tremor. Faint at first, almost imagined. The broom paused mid-sweep. She frowned, glancing toward the valley. The vibration deepened, a low hum rolling through the ground, through her feet, up her bones. The sound grew louder. A rumble. A thunder. It was coming from beyond the hills, deep and growing, until even the icicles above her roof began to quiver. The broom fell from her hands. Birds scattered from the trees. The window panes rattled. The air itself began to pulse. And then she heard it, the unmistakable roar of engines. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. Maria's heart stopped. She stepped to the edge of her porch, squinting against the glare of the snow. Over the rise, the horizon shimmered like heat, but this was no mirage. The road had come alive. A wave of chrome and thunder rolled over the hill, 2,000 bikes, gleaming under the midday sun, stretching as far as her eyes could see. The sound was deafening, like the sky itself had torn open. The ground shook beneath her feet. Windows in nearby houses rattled. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Dogs barked from behind fences. The town came to a halt. People spilled out onto porches, drawn by the noise. They stared wide as an endless river of Hell's Angels thundered down the road, leather jackets flashing red and white, sunlight exploding off polished chrome. Maria pressed a hand to her chest, breath trembling. Leading them, at the very front, were the 20 men she had sheltered. Hulk's black bike gleamed like obsidian, Big Tony's silver engine reflecting the sky. Behind them rode Diesel, his scarf fluttering in the wind, Patch to his right. Head held high, his hand pressed briefly to the small twine cross hanging from his neck. When the first bikes reached her cottage, the rest slowed behind them, an ocean of engines fanning out across the valley. The roar echoed off the mountains, a rolling hymn of metal and devotion. And then, as if obeying some unseen signal, the engines began to cut. One after another. The thunder dwindled until only silence remained, a silence so deep it made her ears ring. The wind caught her shawl, brushing her cheek. She stood on her porch, frozen, her broom still lying in the snow. Around her, the entire town watched from a distance, fearful, uncertain, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. 2,000 bikers in perfect formation, encircling the small wooden home of a poor janitor. Then one man dismounted. Hulk. The sound of his boots crunching through the snow was the only noise left in the world. He took his time crossing the yard, his shadow stretching long across the white ground. Behind him, Big Tony followed, then Patch, their faces solemn and proud. Maria's eyes burned with tears. Her voice failed her. When Hulk finally stopped at the bottom of her porch, he removed his gloves, held them in one hand, and looked up at her. The silence was electric, charged with something too big for words. "Maria Rosales," he said at last, his voice low but carrying over the still air. "The road remembers." Her lips parted, trembling. "Hulk, what is this?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that breaks before it forms. "You gave us warmth when the world turned its back. You healed one of ours. You saved another long before you even knew his name. You showed us what mercy looks like." Tears slipped down Maria's cheeks, falling onto her shawl. Behind Hulk, 2,000 men sat on their bikes in complete silence. No laughter. No noise. Just reverence. Hulk's voice softened. "We don't forget, ma'am. Not you. Not what you did." Patch stepped forward, eyes glistening. He reached into his jacket and held up something small, a twine cross. "You gave me this," he said, voice cracking. "Said kindness always finds its way back." Well, it did. Maria's hand covered her mouth. Her knees trembled. The sight before her, all that chrome, all that thunder turned still in devotion, felt impossible, wholly surreal. The woman no one noticed, the janitor no one spoke to, had become the heart of a story the road itself would carry forever. The sky was cloudless. The air glowed silver and gold. And in that fragile, breathtaking silence, Maria understood. They hadn't just come to visit. They had come to honor. For a long, spellbound moment, the valley was silent. The cold air shimmered with heat from 2,000 idling engines. Maria stood on her porch, tears glinting on her cheeks, as the army of bikers waited in reverent stillness. Then Patch stepped forward, his boots crunching through the snow. His voice trembled, but it carried strong across the hush. "People think the road makes you hard," he said, looking toward the crowd of townsfolk gathering behind their fences. "They think it burns away the good in a man. But the truth is, sometimes, if you're lucky, the road leads you back to someone who shows you what good still looks like." He turned toward Maria, his eyes shining. "Years ago, I was dying near the border. Beaten. Starving. The world had given up on me. But she didn't. Maria Rosales found me, hid me, fed me, prayed for me. I lived because of her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mothers pressed hands to their lips. Children peeked from behind coats. Patch continued, voice thick with emotion. "And last week, when the storm tried to take us, she did it again. Opened her door to 20 bikers no one else would even look at. She saved my brother, Diesel. She saved all of us." He paused, his throat tightening. "So we came back. To make it right." Behind him, Hulk raised his hand, his voice like thunder breaking softly through clouds. "The road remembers, ma'am," he said to Maria. "You gave us mercy. Today, we give you back the world." As he spoke, a distant rumble joined the stillness, deeper, heavier than motorcycles. Maria turned her head and gasped. From the far end of the road, a convoy of trucks rolled in, their trailers packed high. They bore the Hell's Angels crest, the winged skull gleaming beneath the sun. The engines cut, and men jumped out, shouting orders, working like a single heartbeat. Some carried lumber and shingles. Others rolled up paint barrels and new window frames. 2 men hauled a brand new door, still wrapped in plastic. Diesel, still weak but determined, led a crew toward the sagging roofline, hammer in hand. The clatter of hammers, saws, and boots filled the morning. What had been quiet moments ago now roared with life. Neighbors came out, clutching their coats, their eyes wide in disbelief. "Are they affixing her house?" one man whispered. "Those bikers," a woman gasped. But yes, that's exactly what they were doing. 100 men on ladders. Dozens painting, hammering, sweeping. Others stacking firewood, repairing the fence, shoveling snow. In less than an hour, Maria's small, fragile cottage became a hive of noise and laughter. Big Tony walked out of the chaos carrying a crate of groceries, fruits, bread, sacks of rice, and more meat than Maria had seen in years. "Pantry's stocked for a long while, ma'am," he said gently. Another man, Goose, came to her door holding a shiny new stove. "Can't cook miracles on rust, Senora." Maria pressed her trembling hand to her mouth. Her knees felt weak. "You don't have to." Hulk cut her off softly. "We do." He pointed toward the yard, where a new fence was going up, straight and strong. "The world don't give much to folks like you, Maria. So we will." The sun climbed higher. The smell of paint and sawdust mixed with winter air. Children gathered along the fence line, whispering in awe as patched leather jackets moved like angels through the snow. Maria stood frozen on her porch, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her old world, the quiet, forgotten one, was being rebuilt before her eyes. And then, when she thought her heart could hold no more, Big Tony approached her again. He held a thick white envelope in his gloved hand. Across it, in bold black letters, were the words "paid in full." He pressed it gently into her palm. "What is this?" she whispered. Tony smiled, his weathered face soft. "Your debts, your rent, your bills. Covered. For life." Her breath hitched. No, I can't accept this. It's too much." "It's what you deserve," Tony said. "You gave us something we can't buy, can't steal, can't replace." Maria shook her head, the envelope trembling in her hands. "I have nothing to give you." Big Tony's voice broke as he smiled. "You already gave us hope, Maria, and that's worth more than all the money in the world. That did it." Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the snow. Her hands covered her face as sobs tore free, raw, unguarded, holy. The kind of tears that come when grace finally catches up to pain. Hulk knelt beside her, one massive hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Around them, the noise of hammers softened, as if even the men understood that something sacred was happening. Maria looked up at the faces around her, scarred, tattooed, hardened, and saw nothing but tenderness. Her voice trembled through her tears. "You're not devils," she whispered. "You're angels. Every one of you." Hulk's eyes glistened as he nodded. "Maybe, but only 'cause you showed us how." And in that moment, the poorest woman in town became the richest soul in the valley, surrounded not by gold or luxury, but by 2,000 men who had once lost their way and found it again through her kindness. The work was done. By dusk, the air had turned golden, painting every repaired beam and fresh coat of paint in the soft light of a winter sunset. The snow that had once fallen like despair now glittered like hope, scattered across the ground where 2,000 tire tracks cut their marks into the earth. Maria stood at the edge of her porch, the envelope still pressed to her heart. Her cottage, her once broken, forgotten home, stood proud again. A fence lined straight, windows that no longer rattled, a roof that could withstand any storm. Her world had been reborn by the very men the world feared most. The bikers were gathering now, preparing to ride. Engines idled low, like the rumble of thunder waiting just over the horizon. The sight of it made Maria's eyes sting, not from fear this time, but from the ache of saying goodbye. One by one, they came to her, each man embracing her with quiet reverence. Diesel, now smiling weakly, pressed her hand and whispered, "Thank you for breathing life back into us." Goose left a loaf of bread and a promise to visit. Snake left his scarf wrapped around her porch post, saying, "For the wind." Then came Patch, eyes wet but smiling. "You saved me twice, Senora. Once when I was broken, and once when I forgot how to feel." She cupped his face, her thumb brushing the scar that time hadn't erased. "No, Iho, you saved yourself. I only reminded you that you were still alive." Finally, Hulk approached. His heavy boots sank into the snow with each step, the air falling silent around him. The men waited, engines dimming, the world holding its breath. He stopped before her, pulled something small and shining from his pocket, a silver angel pin, its wings outstretched, its face turned toward the sky. He took her hand in his rough leather against frail skin and pressed the angel into her palm. "So you'll remember, Maria," he said, his voice low and steady. "The road always pays its debts." The moment hung suspended in the fading light. Maria looked down at the pin, feeling the metal's warmth seep into her fingers as if the angel carried the heartbeat of every man who had stood in her home. Her voice quivered. "I won't forget you." Hulk's eyes softened. "We know. And we won't forget you either." He turned, mounting his bike. Big Tony and Patch followed. Engines began to roar again, one by one, then all at once, until the air vibrated with the sound of devotion and farewell. The earth shook as 2,000 bikes rolled in unison, a sea of chrome reflecting the dying sun. Maria stood still, the wind tugging at her shawl, her tears glinting like tiny stars. She raised her hand as they rode past, her voice lost beneath the thunder, but her heart speaking loud enough for heaven to hear. When the last bike disappeared over the horizon, the valley fell quiet again. The echo of their engines lingered like a hymn carried on the wind, deep, low, eternal. Maria looked down at the silver pin, then toward the photo of her husband hanging beside the door. His smiling face caught the last light of dusk. She whispered, "Raphael, the angels came for me today." Her words drifted into the twilight. She smiled through her tears, her hand resting over her heart where the pin lay warm against her skin. And as the golden light faded into blue, she felt peace settle over her like a blessing, the kind that only love and grace can leave behind. Because sometimes kindness doesn't just save lives, it calls the angels home. If you felt Maria's story in your heart, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people discover stories of compassion and hope just like this one. Subscribe for more powerful tales of kindness, redemption, and humanity. And before you go, check out the 2 videos on your screen right now, each one carrying the same warmth, the same truth, that love always finds its way back. Sparkles, thank you for watching,